Okay, ladies and gentlemen, could we have the door closed? Thank you very much. Good to go in audio. Translators, nice to see you again this morning. So, first of all, good morning. I'll tell you who I am in a few minutes, or a couple of minutes, for those who weren't here yesterday. But I'm going to be a really lazy moderator, and I'm going to use exactly the same start as we had yesterday. And we had, I think we had an absolutely cracking conversation. And conversation's the word yesterday. So we're at day 2 of Local2030 Hub for Sustainability Solutions. Translators, do you agree we had a cracking conversation yesterday? Nodding vigorously. They're the only people in the building I trust. Okay, thank you. So look, 4 words, which I had assumed, and assumptions are always dangerous, would be a common binding theme. 4 words. For those left furthest behind. No, that's 5. Those left furthest behind. Say them again. Those left furthest behind. Put them in your head now and say them to yourself. Because in my mind, the localization of the SDGs, more than anything, should be about much more impactful, sustainable, consistent development and making better lives for people and communities worldwide, whether that's in the slums and the shanties of the megacities, whether it's in pockets of poverty in the global north, whether it's in the remote Sahelian communities where security and climate change are to the fore, wherever we find those pockets of poverty. And my assumption was that everyone would agree. Now, apparently not. And there's a few people in the room who don't feel that that was necessarily the anchor point, the horizontal point. And they will speak to that, I think, in coming moments. But let me back up a little bit. So I'm Paul Clements-Hunt. I'm moderating yesterday and today, most of the sessions. I have my own little company called the Blended Capital Group, which is focused on sub-Saharan Africa transactions and deals in the sustainable space. No one in this room, I am not dependent on anyone here for my income. So that means that I can moderate without fear of favor. And you're all very esteemed people on the first panel. But I think we should have the same rule that made yesterday super successful in my mind, which is just tight discipline. We want adrenaline shots. We want espresso shots. We want 3 or 4 minutes. We want your rarefied thoughts and experience put on the table to catalyze a conversation. Do you all agree? Yes, that's good. Okay. So I'm just respectfully requesting time discipline, even though we've started a little bit late. So any fundamental questions? Anyone in the wrong room? Anyone not understand my Liverpudlian English? Translators? Oh, there. Okay, good. So today we're doing 3 thematic sessions around this whole concept of local 2030 hubs for sustainability solutions. And I'm actually going to, at some point, ask Kerry Constable from the Executive Office of the Secretary General just to give a little reflection of where that came from, where the hub idea came from, how it evolved after COP21, and where it's gone from there. So Kerry will baseline us a little bit later in the morning. We've got energy, huge, clear. Everybody talked about it yesterday, even though we weren't really talking about energy. So it transcends everything in terms of how we fix that clean energy architecture and deliver it in different ways more effectively. We then move on to an ocean session. And finally, we have poverty alleviation and, yes, it says equality. On the agenda, it should read equity, but that's what we've got. I'm going to stop there. Let's jump into the first session, which is energy. So I'm going to ask the panelists, as I say, those double espressos, the adrenaline shots, put it on the table. What I would also ask individuals in the room is commit to the conversation for the day, if you can. Yesterday, I told people to stop using their iPhones, and then the social media team told me that was exactly the wrong thing to do. So it shows how old-fashioned I am. And by mid-afternoon yesterday, we were trending, and I'm going to tell a naughty secret to everyone in the room. Local Hub 2030 had more tweets than at United Nations. So, I'm not saying anything. Now, I've taken far too much time already. Rachel Kite. Rachel, CEO, Sustainable Energy for All, and Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Sustainable Energy. An iconic leader in this space for a long time. Rachel, the floor is yours, and don't say anything nasty about me. Thank you. 3 to 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to everybody for being here. I'm pleased to be here. I'll jump straight in, just to use the time most effectively. So, just a bit to put the energy challenge in context. We have 1 billion people without access to electricity. We have 3 billion people without access to clean cooking. This is predominantly today a rural problem. It will become an urban problem before we reach 2030 due to the pathways of urbanization and the pathways of economic growth. The 1 billion people without access are predominantly focused in South Asia and across sub-Saharan Africa. There are pockets of lack of access in Pacific Islands, in islands around the world, Haiti. There's about 300,000 people without access to electricity in Latin America, in the rural highlands of the Andes. And depending on the pursuit of austerity and social measures in the developed world, there are communities falling back into energy poverty as affordability and reliability of energy becomes compromised. This is not just a question for those who've been left out of the energy services mix up to now. The pathway to achievement of the SDG, therefore, which is universal access, at least a doubling of energy efficiency on a year-on-year basis, and at least a doubling of renewable energy. So really a revolution in energy productivity and much more renewables in the mix cannot be achieved without a transformation of the way in which we live in cities, the way in which we work in cities, and the way in which we build cities, and the way in which we move around cities. And so there's a huge role for leadership at the community level, the city level, and the regional level. Let's think about what cities mean for energy demand and energy supply. The building stock of the developed world must be refurbished urgently. And I don't mean just, putting, a new roof on. I mean completely stripped out and refurbished. The business models for that are nascent. Who owns the building, who rents the building, who works in the building, who lives in the building are often different people. So working out the financial solution for mass refurbishment has to be a priority for the European Union, for all developed countries and all old cities. For new cities, are we building to keep, or are we building to build and to strip down within a very short period of time? How do we build them? How do we design them? And don't think of buildings as places that use energy, but the buildings of the future will be generators of industry, of energy. And therefore it transforms what it means to be a local leader into not just somebody who's trying to manage energy demand, but somebody who's also in control of supply. Transport. So we know that the pathway for electric vehicles is beginning to look truly revolutionary on a timescale that none of us imagined. You can look at the most recent report from Carbon Tracker and Bloomberg New Energy Finance to see the trajectories. But the tipping point is going to be mass transit, light goods vehicles and buses for the population of the fast urbanizing centers of Africa and Asia. At the point where we can move people in a safe way and in a clean way and in a mass way around the cities of the future, we will again have transformed city energy demand and potentially city energy supply. The appliances that we use, the remarkable efficiency that is needed to provide all of the things that people need at much less watts than it takes today. And this isn't just the cell phone charger and the television and the light and the clean cook stove, etc., that we've been focusing on. But for the future, the livability of cities will also depend on super efficient refrigeration and super efficient cooling, something that we will start working on in due course and will be announcing this week, a major piece of work. So you can see that energy demand by cities and the way in which city leaders set standards and drive up the market for innovation in the provision of super efficient, hyper efficient living is going to be a real game changer. For access, I would just say that the people who live below and beyond the power lines will have their electricity needs met more cheaply, more quickly, by finding off-grid renewable solutions which can then hook up to grid. And that's where we see the pace of change happening in closing the energy access gap. And then I think for renewables, the price of renewables has come down, especially for wind and solar. We haven't even begun to explore the innovative deployment of renewables in urban settings. And I think that there's still much more that can be done. But what do we know from those who commit to only buy renewables? And we know that that's something that city leaders are beginning to do. Well, if we look at the example of business, then every time a company the size of Walmart or Google or IKEA or others commit to only buying renewable energy, they do two things. One is they set a very clear long-term signal for all of their suppliers, but secondly, they send a long-term signal to the financial market that there is a corporate offtake. So there could be a municipal offtake for the long run for renewable energy. That will attract new investors into the space. None of this gets around the problem that city leaders and regional leaders have in their access to the financial markets. And this is something that plagues investment in green futures for cities, is their ability to access markets and the ability that they have to create a new generation of green municipal bonds and other financial instruments. And this remains, I think, an issue of high priority. So the last thing I'd like to say in closing is that there is no route to success for 2030 in SDG 7, nor is there a successful route to the Paris Agreement, nor is there a successful route to success under the Kigali Amendment, under the Montreal Protocol, without finding ways to allow cities and regions to mark out a very different energy pathway. The energy systems of the future will be digitalized, will be decarbonized, and will be decentralized. When you add those three things together, you're basically looking at energy systems which are democratized, and there's nobody better able to exploit that than locally elected leaders. Thank you.
Rachel, brilliant as ever. Now, Rachel's leaving us at 11:15, so I'm going to take a few minutes now just to open up some conversations. But Kerry, I'm going to put you on the spot for a super brief description of the hub. And you're also going to ask a direct question to Rachel in terms of how that vision of a hub and the energy pieces that Rachel has just described, how that should interface and how it should work together. Don't give yourself 30 seconds to prepare. I'm also going to warn the panel. I'm going to warn the panel and take me seriously. The millennials have arrived on the back row. Now, they delivered, the best questions yesterday, and I'm not spinning that up. So I want questions from the millennium. I want questions from the millennials and put them on the spot. You've got some great energy experts on the panel. Good? No, James, you're not a millennial. All right. So listen, Kerry, are you good to go? The quick hub, and then to Rachel, how does the energy piece interface with this idea of the hub, and how can it play out? Please, Kerry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for putting me on the spot. So the hub derived from the cities and climate action work that the Executive Office of the Secretary General led for COP21, and the origin of this was we really felt that from the office that local level implementation was critical to achieve the Paris Agreement, and now the office and the entire UN system believe it is critical, as Rachel mentioned, to implement both the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. So that's the source of the hub, the origin. The energy, as Rachel mentioned, she said it much better than I could, that cities and regions are critical, that there is no way that we can achieve the implementation of SDG 7 and energy across all of the SDGs without decentralizing and truly decentralizing. So what I would ask Rachel, which which I'm completely making up, but I think is what Rachel thinks a new multi-stakeholder platform that brings the UN and financiers together could do to really transform this space, to transform both cities to do more, collaborate on financing solutions, and also highlight the role of governors in regions.
Yeah, no, Rachel, go for it, yeah.
I mean, so there are structural problems that many cities and regions face that don't go away just because you're talking about sustainable development and climate action. So, you know, the vast majority of cities, not just in the developing world but in the developed world, are are in financial extremis. I mean, they're not in good financial shape. They don't have great creditworthiness. And so some of the work that I think is really important is work that was pursued in the run-up to Paris, which was about, you know, basically helping cities get on the path to financial well-being, because that's going to be absolutely dependent for anything that a city wants to do to build its resilience to climate impacts, to putting itself onto a greener growth path, to attracting more businesses, etc. And so I think that's an absolute priority. And you know, I'm not so worried about the Londons and the Parises and the New Yorks of this world, but how do we bring, how do we bring Podunk, Illinois along with us, right? How do we bring everybody forward with roadmaps for success? So that's one thing. The second thing I think is if you're going to be really brutal about it, and we look at, so let's take an energy perspective and let's just look at access to energy. And you think about where are the 1 billion people who don't have access, and you map that, and then you look at the countries where those 1 billion people are, and you look at the quality of the regulatory environment, and that's been done. That's work that's been done by the World Bank and others under the auspices of SC for All. And then you start looking at the urbanizing dynamic in those countries, and then you start looking at which of those city leaders has already signed up to the compact of mayors, or etc. And you start to see a leadership group where perhaps we need to focus. And I think that picking the places where we can show what progress looks like and how quickly it can be achieved, and how quickly you can reverse trends within a locale, and how quickly you can start to attract investment in, is important. And so that's sort of work that we have underway with some of the groupings of city leaders, etc., is to try to look at the critical pathway for achievement of SDG 7, and then looking at which cities are on that pathway and working out, you know, what do they need in order to be able to close the energy access gap cleanly, affordably, reliably. So, you know, we can't do everything for everybody everywhere, but making sure that we're getting the basics right is really important, and then perhaps showing what success looks like. I mean, you're going to hear from Philips later, right? If Philips can provide, you know, efficient, renewable, clean street lighting in Madrid, Buenos Aires, I think the question to Philips is, what does Philips need to be able to, together with other lighting companies, make sure that every mid-sized and large city in Latin America has efficient, clean lighting? And if there's a financial product that's not on the market, and there have been attempts but they've never been successful, then what's it going to take to bring that financial product to market? I think we're not at the point of discussing, do we need clean street lighting? We're at the point of saying, Philips knows how to do this. How do Philips and others get the financial product that allows them to roll it out at scale?
Rachel.
So and she will talk in much more detail about it later.
Yeah, Rachel's just taking your spot. Sorry about that, Barbara. Thank you. Rachel, great stuff. Kerry, I think Rachel partly just mapped where your hubs should be located, so thank you for that. Please send an invoice to the Secretary General. Okay, so Rachel, I've got one hanging question before we move on. Did we have any questions out there? Okay, brief question. Thank you. Janie Beck from?
Penn, University
Great,
of Pennsylvania.
okay.
Is there actually a hub for energy now, or are you in the process of creating it?
So for energy, Sustainable Energy for All exists. We're an entity that spun out of the UN last year, And our headquarters are in Vienna, Austria, and we have a small office in Washington. I'm the CEO of that group of people. So our job is to be the engine room of a movement of companies and organizations and member states who are pursuing SDG 7, right? And then I'm also the special representative of the Secretary General for Sustainable Energy, and I co-chair UN Energy, which is an attempt to bring the UN agencies together around a critical path of what the UN should be doing to support member states to have success in SDG 7. So, we're an experiment in mobilizing and organizing, and we're an experiment that other issues are looking at where there isn't a UN agency responsible for the issue. I mean, energy is pursued by, many different parts of the UN.
Rachel, we've got one question from this gentleman, brief one from me, and then we'll move on. But you're setting the conversation up beautifully. Thank you. If you could introduce yourself in a brief question.
Yeah.
My name is Simon. I'm an urban farmer, and I guess we're tackling very similar issues in the sense of how do you take an urban environment and make it more sustainable? Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you've got any good urban case studies that have shown people moving from consumers of energy to producers of energy. There's one I'm aware of in Brooklyn called Brooklyn Microgrid, but I haven't looked into it in too much detail.
Yeah, you should go look at the Brooklyn Microgrid because it's the closest hand version of that. But I think that there are. So first of all, 10% of our food today is coming from urban production. That number is going to have to increase, and so whether it's, I live in I live just outside Washington D.C., and so the new business models now where restaurants are becoming vertically integrated with their own supply of vegetables from roofs and gardens in the city. So it's just beginning to take off. But I think when you go further east, that's where you see a lot of real innovation. So some of the imagination of what the green cities of China and Southeast Asia are going to look like is going to be really important. When you see the effort in Jakarta and some other cities around financial services for greener buildings, green mortgages, how do you set incentives in place within an urban real estate market to force the pace of improvement of energy efficiency in green buildings and green building materials, and how do you mix that with true green buildings, right? So I think that you start to see an awful lot happening in Asia. I think obviously in the older cities of Europe you're seeing lots of innovation as well, and there's room for much more innovation in this country. But I think that as cities start talking to each other because they have to, because federal government is not acting as that exchange of information anymore, hopefully you'll actually see progress move much more quickly. So I'm optimistic, and it's a flat world, and there's much that will happen in the new built cities of the future, which will be in Asia and Africa, that the old built cities will have to learn from. So
Rachel,
that's a kind of general answer, but we can talk later.
One last question from me, which is, you use the term falling back into energy poverty. I guess falling back to any form of poverty is a dreadful experience for the individual or for the family or for the community. But the WHO have figures on health where every year 100 million people fall back into poverty because of out-of-pocket payment costs for health. 150 million get under intensifying financial stress. Do we have similar stats for the energy piece? Because I guess that's a huge percentage of daily, weekly income for families and communities at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of those energy costs. Is that something that's been calculated?
If it has, I don't have my hand on those numbers. I mean, I could go away and look at it. Where we do, so what we see is that energy bills, either because the size of the bill is increasing, or because the capacity to pay for it is decreasing, or both, mean that you start to eat cold food. You don't heat your food. You don't heat your room. It leads to childhood illnesses. It leads to illness within the family. So we know, we see that happening, and you see it directly happening as a result of reversal of public policy. And I can give you examples from the UK over the last 3 to 4 years where there's a direct correlation between the changes in support to local community energy efforts and then to impacts on social services. I think what we also see is the 6 million people who die every year from indoor air pollution, and that's the lack of an effective market for the provision of clean fuels for cooking solutions. And so we do work with WHO on some of these aspects, but exactly what the size of the impact is of falling back into energy poverty, we don't have numbers on that. But
Got you. Rachel, thank you. Let's put our hands together because it was a great setup. Rachel, I guess we've got you for another half an hour. Is that right?
Yeah.
About that. Thanks very much again. Let's move on now. So our second panelist is Mr. Rodrigo Aguilar, who's the Senior VP with Fortius and Power. Rodrigo, welcome. The floor is yours for 3 to 4 minutes. Thank you very much.
Here, thanks, of course, Kerry, for the invitations. And, well, let me start saying that our company is based in Mexico. It's 100% owned by Mexican investors. And we are new on this clean energy industry. We've been making profits and money for a long time, but from fossil fuels. We have, of course, we've been selling fuel for the last 25 years. And we just came with the idea that we are coming from a generation, our parents' generations, where if you wanted to be successful in Mexico, you have to make money, right? So the opportunity is making money. We're talking about 1950s, 1960s. What we strongly believe, after selling gas for 25 years, that my generation, if you want to be successful, you have to make the difference. That's why I celebrate the fact that millennials are here with us, because we're thinking on that. As a company, we're thinking on making a difference, and it's not that hard when you have the government support. Now, with the energy reform in Mexico, there is a huge possibilities to make business in terms of generation clean energy. And that was the case in Mexico, and we are right there. But we are right there at the state level, at the municipal level. Why? Because we are focusing especially on street light-led energy for cities. So for instance, we developed a model that has been quite successful. We are now going to provide for a city of 1.5 million people. We're going to provide for the following 18 years around 85,000 street lights, LED street lights for the following 18 years. But that wasn't easy because I come from a country that we don't usually think on a long-term basis. So we need to talk a lot with politicians at the three levels of governments: national level with the Ministry of Finance, state level, and municipal level. So what helped us a lot to get this thing done in this city of Zapopan? The fact that we have a governor who is 42 years old. The state of Jalisco, I don't know if you've been there, it's the land of tequila and mariachi. I really encourage you to go someday. But the state of Jalisco is around 7.5 million province, and it's in the center-west part of Mexico. And particularly, this governor has been very advocate about climate change. And that helped us a lot, because we as a company, if we approach to this government and say, you know what, we're going to make business, we're going to do this, then a lot of things flow very easily. So I have to say that the support of a governor or a political leader that believes on this help us a lot. I think political will, for a business perspective, has been everything. Of course, our business model is a huge part of this because government are investing 0 Mexican pesos in this project. And we have developed this model, and we are willing to replicate this model in the future. So bottom line, I just want to say thank you. And If I wanted to do something, to increase this business in Mexico, I will definitely replicate these sort of discussions like the one that we've been having since yesterday, but regionally, in my state, in my municipality. So I think this is very rich discussion, and also this is a multi-stakeholders thing. So that's it.
Kerry, your team have got to mark that. This has got to go viral, this discussion, definitely, okay? Rodrigo, thank you. We're going to take a couple of quick questions for Rodrigo, but I've got one to kick off, which was, we got the point clear in terms of educating politicians in some ways to catalyze policy action at the national, the subnational, the community level. But what's the financing model or what's the innovation, and Rachel referred to it, what's the financing model that allows you to do what you do, right?
It's a very complex financial model. I will probably spend like half of the day explaining it.
That's fine, let's go. Okay.
If you go. But the basic thing is that energy costs are, lowing. We have like 2 cents per kilowatts per hour in Mexico. We sell that in Mexico, so that's helping us a lot to reduce a lot of cost. But also, we have a lot of assets from the other companies that we are using to finance this. Okay. So we're in a way we're putting not bad money, we're putting money from other companies to finance these sort of projects in a bet for a long-term changing culture of the company.
So your fossil fuel income, you're in some ways cross-subsidizing to your renewable piece, but that's part of a long-term planning horizon.
If I want to put it in one thing, that is what we're doing.
Are we seeing that in Southern Africa? Same sort of thing? Are we seeing any financial models evolving whereby a fossil fuel player is beginning to think, we've got to spice the energy mix up, go into new renewables, go into clean, and bringing that money to allow that transition? Is that happening?
Unfortunately, it's not. In the South African case, unfortunately, I'd say the electricity utilities almost actively trying to keep out the independent power producers because, they've been a monopoly. And I think the government had taken a very strong stance on bringing in independent power, especially almost 5 gigawatts of renewables. But it slowed down in the last year or two, which is quite unfortunate, especially given the pricing benefits that you've seen in terms of the significant drop in renewables. So it's something that I think at the local level, in particular, cities, provinces need to be driving as an agenda, given some of the slowdown at the national level that's taking place on that. We're trying to do that by also pushing, we as the Development Bank of Southern Africa, by pushing more embedded solar PV and other such issues to continue to bring in renewables into the mix.
Okay, look, that's a really good thread there. Rodrigo, again, thank you very much. I'm going to move straight on to the next speaker, and I'm delighted to say we have Ms. Namita Vikas, who's Group President and Global Head Climate Strategy and Responsible Banking for Yes Bank, one of my favorite and most dynamic banks in the responsible finance and sustainable investment space. So, Namita, thank you for joining us. I believe it's been a long flight, but the floor is yours for 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks a lot. And well, it was not a long flight since I came in from Germany, so there's some solace. Having said that, I think this is a very interesting discussion that I've been hearing, where finance is emerging to be the key player to move the needle in the right direction. Energy has emerged as a global strategic commodity. And how do then governments look at a kind of a coalition come together? Because at the end of the day, it's policies are going to drive to some degree the movement of finance into the flow of finance into the sector. So that's at the first level. I would say that if you look at India and, going back to coalition, I think the International Solar Alliance with 121 countries coming together, the Prime Minister of India leading this initiative has created a kind of a forum for countries to share experiences, best practices, particularly on generation of solar, innovative financial mechanisms in solar, and much needs to be seen. I would like to just say here is this is all connected to demand supply, which is interlinked to really the risks and the opportunities that exist as far as financing the energy sector is concerned. And in India particularly, the challenge is about availability, accessibility, and affordability of energy. And on the other side, bankable products. So there is enough capital and there are enough projects. However, bridging that gap is extremely important. And therefore, how do financial institutions really look at mitigating the risks? So if you look at the renewable energy sector in India, it is pretty matured. Also the fact that the government of India has taken a target of generating 175 gigawatts of renewable power by 2022. There is enough investment that is flowing through to this sector. Having said that, the off-grid sector, because the risks of the off-grid sector in terms of the policy risks, the technology risks, the uncertainties in terms of the guaranteed loads, so on and so forth, those are the sectors which really need the right amount of financing. So what we've been doing is we've been leveraging, Yes Bank is the 4th largest private sector bank in India, and we have a very healthy portfolio of sustainable finance. We have been looking at how do you innovate for one, bottom of the pyramid, so that connects to the SDGs. How do you innovate to credit enhance those renewable projects and source cheaper capital for those renewable projects. So I would like to cite a couple of examples here. In terms of, we saw that in end of 2015, the government of India introduced certain policy relaxations, tax exemptions to the infrastructure sector, and banks were allowed to do different financial instruments. So we took the plunge, and having understood the renewable energy market very well, we issued India's first green bond. And green bond has really emerged as one of the sweetheart financing instruments. It's become very popular. It has gone up from just in 2016 from to $91 billion. So that's across the world, with $3 billion from India. After Yes Bank issued its first bond, green bond, it was a $160 million dollar bond. We saw 15 other issuances in India, and the regulator then standardizing with certain procedures and policies to issue green bonds in India. Subsequently, the IFC issued a rupee-denominated bond on the London Stock Exchange, where the proceeds came to India, to Yes Bank's green bond. And I think this was a very strategic investment, which was a demonstration of how a multilateral development bank used its AAA rating to raise finances from mainstream investors at cheaper capital, and then pass that through to an emerging market financier to be able to deploy the money in an emerging market. So I think, these are more and more innovative mechanisms that we require. And one, I really resonate with what Rachel said, that, big cities and investments in big cities is at a level growing. But what about the small remote areas? I mean, India, huge country, huge landscape. So what we looked at, and this is an interesting innovation that I want to particularly cite here, is we looked at how blended finance can actually work to be able to touch different or impact different developmental aspects. And we used this in case of salt pan farmers. So there are 48,000 salt pan farmers which work in the west of India, and these are destitute women farmers, most of them, where their income after the end of the season starts in September, ends in April, end of the season is not more than $350, $400. And one of the biggest input costs is to run diesel pumps to draw the brine from the ground to make salt. So we looked at an intervention here where the input cost was to buy diesel, and the finance was sourced from money lenders, where the interest rate was anything between 36 to 100%. So that was the kind of impact of sourcing that capital. So we said, how can we mainstream this? So we took a cohort of 600 women farmers, and we looked at replacing diesel pumps to solar pumps on the back of no charity, but giving them mainstream finance from a local bank. Now, obviously, the local bank will not take a risk on such poor women, so we credit enhanced it, and we stood guarantee. Plus, the local bank rate of interest was 13%, so we did a credit subvention, an interest subvention of 8%, so the women could only pay 5%, a 5-year loan, and a capacity building to be able to maintain this and educate the women on how they can work. Now, this is a very iconic kind of an innovation that we've put together for 600 women because it is not for Yes Bank to play the role of the credit enhancer or the support, but we want to really mainstream it and be the local bank, given the aggregating nature of the economy. So I think these are the kind of mechanisms that are really required, and we are looking at how we can bring this together.
You know, so that really, Namita, that's a lovely example. And I mean, Rachel mentioned credit enhancement at the city level. You're mentioning credit enhancement, you know, really at the grassroots level. And it's that type of, it's not as though we haven't thought of these things before, we just haven't implemented them at scale, right? And the financial services sector doesn't lack imagination when it wants to make money for itself. So if we can harness that in a healthy way, as you've just described, it makes a powerful difference. But thank you for your comments, and that type of really specific, concrete example is exactly what we need on the table, you know. And Kerry, in terms of hubs and taking this conversation forward, you know, we've got the link there, Mexico, DBSA. There's a really, really healthy conversation there. Credit enhancement. There's really rich material beginning to flow out that I think it's important your team capture. I am going to jump on to the next speaker, and then we're going to try and ring fence a good conversational space towards the end. So if my glasses are still working, again, Namita, thank you for your input. Let's put our hands together. I think you're all... As I said a few times yesterday, hand clapping avoids deep vein thrombosis, all right? So we do not have death by PowerPoint. We do not have DVT. It's good. And we've got some really good speakers left. There's not as many people. I guess people will trickle back in. But my instinct is to keep this conversation going for 30 minutes. So we get the presentations and we pick up some of the threads, and I'm sure some of our colleagues will join us. That would mean a lunch break at about 12:30 rather than 12. And I would suggest we then perhaps look to do the thematic session started at 1, where it's meant to, yeah? Okay, so half an hour lunch break. Can people live with that? Yeah. And if you can't, I'm sure you won't come back, so that's fine. All right, good. Where were we? Can anyone remind me? Okay, good. Thank you very much. So we're going to jump back in and... re-kicking off energy from where we left. I would like to invite, once I get my papers sorted out, Mr. Amar Bhattacharya. Bhattacharya.
It's an Indian name with an Italian pronunciation.
Senior Fellow, Global Economy and Development, Brookings Institute. An Indian name with an Italian pronunciation. Okay. Wonderful. Okay, the floor is yours.
All right, so I'm going to be quite telegraphic. And I'll begin, Paul, with... Let's have one conversation.
Okay? Let's focus back into the discussion. Sorry, Mr.
Okay, yeah, so I'm going to begin with saying why I disagreed with you yesterday, that those left farthest behind is the real only filter to look at this agenda. And I think the reason I mentioned that is because the other crisis other than those left farthest behind, is our planet left behind. And in your second title of sustainable solutions, you know, sustainability has to be looked through many different filters, but looking at it through climate and environmental sustainability is going to be critical. And then, and this agenda that we are focusing on right now really brings those two elements to the core. And that's why I think it's quite appropriate that I raise it in this session, that I hope you will keep this sustainability theme as another very important part of the solutions that we are trying to put on the table.
Do you know, let me respond very quickly to that, because I think the way you've done it is beautiful and respectful, and I completely agree with you. But the synapse it triggered in my head was, do you remember a few weeks ago when Schwarzenegger and President Macron did that Instagram that went viral where they said, let's make the planet great again?
Yeah.
All right?
Exactly.
And Remy from SOS Sahel, who's worked across the Sahel, who's not here at the moment, they then met President Macron in Bamako, Mali, on July the 2nd in the context of the G5 security discussions. And they played back to him that idea. They basically said, look, let's make the planet great again, and we should start in the Sahel.
Yep.
And for me, that's that link between planetary health and vulnerable communities. So completely agree with you. Floor's back to you. Thank you for that clarification. Okay. And for those people who don't know, this fine gentleman at the opening session yesterday raised his hand, and I said, we'll get back to you. So I'll fulfill my pledge, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Back to you.
Okay. So the second message I want to give, and it was embedded in what Rachel said, is that climate action is no longer a cost, it's an opportunity. And it is, in fact, the only sustainable option on offer, because high carbon growth is not sustainable and will leave growth and people behind. So, and part of that, by the way, is is a recognition that the costs of inaction are very high, but on the other side, the costs of action have now become very attractive because of the reduction of costs and the opportunities offered by technology. So that's the backdrop, and Rachel, I think, captured it very well. So I just want to take some takeaways. I don't want to repeat because we've had some excellent presentation. So the first takeaway that I would put on the table is that local level implementation must go hand in hand with scaling up and reorienting investments. Okay? It's not just about doing things at the local level, it's about doing them at scale, and it's about reorienting investments massively towards a different trajectory. That's what Rachel was saying very much again in her remarks. And the question is, what does that require? What does that mean? So, in a sense, again, as the conversation brought out, when we talk about local level, we are talking at actually two ends of the spectrum. We are talking about cities, which is anything but small these days. You know, in ancient times, there were two cities with a population of 1 million, and that was basically Xi'an in China and Rome in Europe. Today we have 300 cities with a population more than 1 million. There were only 27 in 1950, and by 2030 there were almost 600 cities with a population more than 1 million. So that's not small. Okay, these are entities of massive agglomeration that we have seek to transform. And the other thing about cities that are important to keep in mind, and that most of the cities of tomorrow have yet to be built. We will put in more infrastructure in the next 15 years than exists on the planet today. It's a great challenge, but it's also a great opportunity. And unfortunately, what we are building today is still more of the past rather than more of the future. So getting cities right is going to be one part, and Rachel was talking very much about the transformative agenda there. But on the other side, in countries like mine, like India, or in Central America or Africa, tremendous opportunities for distributed systems. Okay? And we are already beginning to see that happening in many parts of the world. And you don't need, you can go off grid and you can build smart infrastructure. Now I want to quickly mention three things that did not come out of the discussion. One is that local level actions have to be supported by policy that is supportive. And in the energy space, the most important policies are elimination of fossil fuel subsidies and moving on carbon price. Okay? We didn't talk about it, but it's absolutely central to bring about the change we are talking about. But in the context of let's not forget those most left behind, we have to find effective social safety nets to be able to deal with the costs of this. Otherwise, there's no way that they will have access to affordable power. So there's a big challenge. There are models that are coming up right now, but that's going to be a big thing. Joe Stiglitz and Nick Stern headed a commission that just came out with a report on carbon pricing, and that suggests that carbon pricing today should move very quickly to $40 to $50 a ton. There are maybe about 5 jurisdictions in the world that has that kind of price. So it's a challenge for rich and poor countries alike, and a bigger challenge for poor countries. The other theme that came out is the central importance of innovation, okay? And ratcheting up on the innovation front. We heard about LEDs, and the case study of India is stellar in how quickly that spread. But we need to move beyond that to really much more difficult innovation. The example of buildings that Rachel gave, is a very complex and difficult one. It sounds easy, super efficient refrigeration, heating, converting trash to bioenergy. In China, more coal is consumed within the house than India uses in a year. Okay. So there's tremendous potential for using innovation to transform things, even in a country like China. And the last issue that's of, as the words goes, ginormous importance is finance. So municipal finance, we talked about it, but we have to recognize that, we are talking about cities that will not have the institutional, technical, and financial capacity. So how do you develop municipal finance to make these cities creditworthy? Okay? And who are going to be the institutions that are going to back them up in terms of credit enhancement? When you look at the entire MDB portfolio and the NDB portfolio and what they are doing on city finance, it's a sliver. So we really have a massive job of scaling up. The other aspect is the cost of capital. Okay? In a country like Brazil, to build an infrastructure project costs 50 to 20%. You can't build any sustainable infrastructure with that kind of cost of finance. On top of that, we have problems of innovation risks, problem with exchange rate risk, problem with developer risk, problems with counterparty risks. So who's going to do the risk mitigation? Governments don't have the balance sheets to do that mitigation. So I think getting this totality of finance, both in structures, but also replicability, is a big challenge. This is what I work on. It's a big, complex challenge. But without that, local level solutions are not going to work.
Mr. Bhattacharya, is that better? Bhattacharya. So much to unpack there. But on the finance piece, you're driving right to the heart of the issue. And one question, but then we're going to go to the next speaker. Because again, I'm keen to ring fence sort of 15 minutes before the close, because I think that's
microphone.
Comes for the audience in asking you questions and picking your brain. It's a new political economy, right? And at the very heart of that, let me be simplistic. It's about the ability to raise taxes. And the combination of the ability...
Microphone for the speakers, please. There can be no interpretation without sound.
Innovation in and around finance to remake the municipal model, right? And we know the forces of inertia in finance are always there if people are making good money out of a current model. That's a critical issue, right? How important in your work, the subsidies piece is key on fossil fuels, but how important is the tax regime and the ability to raise taxes and the ability to channel taxes into that type of long-term infrastructure? Apologies to the translators. It wasn't my fault. Okay. Can I ask that one question? And maybe we come back to it, but I want to put it on the table just now. And with that, I'm going to go to the next speaker. And you've been very patient. People tried to undermine you with fire alarms and all sorts of stuff. So thank you for coming back. And I would therefore like to introduce Ms. Kavita Gupta, who is the lead mission investor for the Eric Schmidt Family Foundation. The floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. There are two things which I want to mention. Before I get deeper, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be on the same platform with Ms. Rachel Kite. When I first joined World Bank Treasury to work on green bonds, I think she has been an inspiration since 2005 for me. And
who's been an inspiration?
Ms. Kite.
Oh, right, okay.
The second thing, I want to pick something which Mr. Bhattacharya was talking about, the innovation. I think the innovation with respect to capital markets, with respect to private equity, or whether we talk about on the state level, government level, or all the way at the grassroots level, the innovation hasn't really happened in the energy market. We keep on taking the same models and keep on putting it into different countries, different layers, but we are not creating anything new. The last biggest thing which was created was green bonds. And since then, there has not been any financial derivative product in the market. So 2007 was the last innovation in the public equity market I could think of. 2011 was the last private equity market when we started having layers of municipality bonds or structures which can directly go to the people investing in it. So I'm actually very surprised that why multinational organizations like World Bank, IFC, UN, IMF are actually not creating innovations when it comes to capital markets. The other word which I haven't heard on this panel so far, and maybe I have been missing that particular word because that's the world I come from, is ecosystem. Without an ecosystem and using energy just as a point of access or as the main pillar to create an ecosystem, we cannot have a sustainable model. We have seen it again and again through our work from McKinsey's to World Bank to IFC to today what we are doing, that once we provide an access to energy or a low-cost access to energy, in both systems, until and unless we don't create a sustainable ecosystem about which United Nations has now come up with SDGs to put them in a perspective, we really cannot support the same energy prices, the financial structures of those energy prices in the long run. Because if we are providing the first-time energy to off-grid market with respect to picogrids, microgrids, how long do we expect impact investors or state governments to really put tax subsidies into it? Until and unless it's not going to be sustainable by itself, it's not going to be a business unit supported by itself, none of the energy projects are ever going to work. And that goes back to one of the points which you were mentioning, is that people are not going to go in a very large scale for the project till there is no financial sustainability around that project. And that's true for both micro level and a very big macro level. And how do we create that financial sustainability without making it all about capital markets? And that's where I think I'm going to use the last of my 2 minutes into it by talking about some examples, because I think the things which we have seen actually working in the market and how they have created impact and accelerated impact over time. So I'll start from New York City because that's where we are, and we are talking about local global programs. There is one of our portfolio companies known as Block Power, which works right in the hoods, Bronx areas, Queens areas, where when we talk about United States, I come from India. When we were talked about United States, we were taught that this is the benchmark society you have to move into. And then you come here, and then you go to Boroughs, and you're like, this is interesting. This is not the benchmark society I was told about. And so we came across Block Power, which basically goes and work with community housing, places of worships, and really old buildings where low-income societies of this New York City lives, and work there to provide individual microgrids to the community houses. And one of the biggest findings they found is the old coal system, oil system, heating programs actually has been creating asthma in those units and increasing it by 62%. So the kids were getting asthma, every kid which was born has the probability of having asthma under the age of 6 months, 62% higher. And so this is the program, this is the energy access issues which we are talking about, which is within 3 to 4 miles from here. Then from New York City, I'll take you to another project which was done in India, where right outside Delhi, which is the capital of the country, if you go 50 miles outside the country, outside the capital, you will find so many areas which still does not have any connection to the electricity. So from efficiency, we are talking about the access issues. And then I'm going to take you to all the way in Africa into Congo, where we just did a very big project. We have been doing it for the last 5 years, but we opened up electricity for 60,000 families, which was not only the first time access, but basically to create a sustainable business solutions out there. And now I'm going to trace how those three particular examples, why I picked it and how they are connected. The problem with the New York City is not access, it's not the support of the local state or the city, it's not the exposure. The problem is there are no players who really wants to go and work in the areas because the financial sustainability is out of it. The state government, the city government can provide you to kickstart it, but they're not going to support you year after year to keep on getting tax rebates. So what is the sustainable solution when you don't want to charge your customers because your customers can't even afford good food, forget about paying for the electricity? Then in a country where energy should be a part of your right is a place where you're not able to provide the right electricity, or the way you're providing electricity is deteriorating health. So that issue still exists. We don't have a sustainable solution. Block Power has created a very innovative solution, stacking the capital from impact investors to grant money to tax subsidies and everything. But I don't see that's a sustainable solution in a long run. Then connecting it to the place of India where you're talking about access problem, right? The access problem out there is not that the state government and the city government have given money in last 3 years, 2 years, as Nimita was talking about, but the banks which they are working with does not reach outside the cities. The banks are ready to give funding to the city level projects when you have big apartment complexes and you can get state taxes to basically build up solar cities out there. And then going back to my third example with Congo and relating, and I think I would love for UN to look at one of these projects, is basically creating a whole sustainable economy, start access to energy as the entry point, use that to create job opportunities, create more liquidity in the market by paying these people to work, then they can afford that electricity, and then start providing them low-cost access to health and education, and slowly take generational impact so that they can now actually afford it, not only afford it, but support it for the other layer of poverty income people. So I think what we did in Congo, and I can go offline because of limitation of time and can talk more about it, is something we probably should be doing outside New York City, in one of the boroughs, should be doing in India. And I think the time has come with the innovation that the countries like US, Germany, and a lot of places actually needs to go to Africa and learn the innovation happening out there. I rest my question.
What's the geographical area? I mean, how concentrated are the people, and where exactly in the Congo is it?
It's the place which I'm talking about is Virunga National Park, which used to be the third most conflict zone at the border of Rwanda, Uganda. And today, because of the project in the last 5 years, there's a local economy of $228 million, which is self-made, not supported by government, by the people. And also it has fallen from the 3rd to the 9th conflict zone.
Kerry, for me, and again I'm being simplistic, but that's the way I am, for me to just describe the hub example, which is really neat. We are going to bounce straight onto the next speaker, and then we're going to ring fence 10 minutes, because we're not going to finish till 35.
Microphone.
I'm sure you all understand the sort of Formula One nature of this, but that was, again, Mr. Bhattacharya's example plus yours. This could have been a fantastic conversation for the next 3 days, but we're just trying to tease people. Rajiv, Joshi from B Team, the floor is yours for 3.5 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
It's a privilege to join all of you here. Not working, but I'll move along.
That's been bad for the last 2 days. Just give us one sentence on B Team. Okay?
Yeah, sure. And I've been following on the web TV. Sorry I missed the first section, but I was watching all of you online on my way here before the fire drill. The B Team is essentially a collective of some of the world's leading influencers from business and civil society. So it includes business leaders like Richard Branson and Paul Polman, Ratan Tata, but it also includes civil society leaders and former heads of state like Mary Robinson, who are all working together to really transform the role of business in addressing these kinds of issues. So there are a number of things that I wanted to contribute today and very much complement some of the examples and thought leadership that's come from my colleagues on the panel, including Rachel and Kavita and Amar and our colleague from Mexico. I think we are at a critical moment in time. We recognize that in 2017, we only have 13 years now to deliver on the promise of the 2030 agenda. And that's not so much time. To consider that energy wasn't even part of the MDGs in terms of the goals that were included, that we've now got an agenda that is fresh that we need to deliver on in a very short period of time. But we can also draw hope. There's a compelling business case, and history has shown us that this is possible. China, for example, provided energy to 500 million people between 1980 and 1990, achieving 100% energy access almost by 2010. Now, obviously, that wasn't all achieved through access to renewable and clean energy, but what we've seen at the same time is a significant drop in the cost of renewable energy at a level that is unprecedented and beyond the trends that were anticipated. One of the big opportunities that we really need to think about is that renewable energy access at a local level enables us to receive a double dividend, not just or a triple dividend. Not just does it provide low-cost access in a distributed network, recognizing that distributed energy is coming at a higher cost, but also it enables local employment, provides jobs for young people, which is a key factor in reducing conflict, also helps to combat gender equality. We've seen a number of examples in the B team, for example, in Copa in Kenya, which is one of our companies, Safaricom, is heavily involved in, provides solar energy access, and essentially poor people put a deposit of $35 down and pay 50 cents per day for a year. And by the end of the year, they have the full ownership of their energy production. So essentially, they have full sustainable energy for the rest of their lives at a cost of $35 plus 50 cents a day. So these are the kinds of solutions that we need to scale up. The real question is, how do we scale these solutions up? The business case is clear, but it's not been well articulated. We need to find ways of making the arguments that we make in these rooms better heard in the town halls, in the districts and municipalities around the world, where many of the lobby groups and many of the interest groups of the fossil fuel industry are continuing to sell power to poor people at a cost that is much higher than they can afford and at a much higher cost to their health. When you look at burning kerosene, for example, and the impacts that has on not just asthma but on other diseases, these costs are not being taken into account when we articulate the kind of cost of energy. And I think one of the innovations that is developing in the business community now is something called social profit and loss accounting, where a number of companies are starting to look at the true cost of their production, both on the environmental side but also on the social side. And health is a critical component of that cost. Second thing to talk about is mobilizing action. How do we really start to turn this platform into a global partnership for delivering sustainable energy for all by 2030, particularly ending energy poverty by 2030? And this is where we feel that there's a need for not just large companies, but also entrepreneurs and small and medium-sized enterprise to be much more part of the conversation. We don't see so many SMEs being represented in these discussions. We think it's time for the UN and others to really ensure that entrepreneurs are part of the solution. Many of them are choosing to produce goods and services that stand for something. And many of the young people in our generation are choosing to work for brands that produce products that also stand for something. And so this is a trend that we need to recognize, where millennials can really articulate and engage in these kinds of issues. The final thing I think we need to really think about, and has been mentioned by our colleagues from Yes Bank, and is around capital. Financing this transition is going to take a significant amount of capital. However, of the $273 trillion of assets that we have in the global economy, we do have the potential to shift the $70 billion that's required to achieve sustainable energy for all, if we use distributed networks, in this direction, if we start to look at long-term capital flows. So we need to start thinking about influencing pension funds, influencing some of the investors that are actually interested in long-term returns for people and the planet. And so that's one question that I think we need to try and address as part of this forum. I'll finish my 3.5 minutes, but it's got to take business, civil society, and local communities working together.
Rajiv, brilliant. My glasses are about to fall off, which is not brilliant. Thank you for that input. I think it's really important. I'm putting UNEP on watch, and I'm also putting the Chicago Chicago Council of Global Affairs on watch. I would like you to feed back into the conversation briefly in terms of what you've heard, what you're impressed by in a couple of minutes or so. But I want to, and really thank you for that input, because it was fresh and you covered a lot of ground very quickly and asked some really big questions. I'd like to have a 2-day conversation with you about influencing pension funds, all right? And the challenges there, but it won't happen now. Mr. Bhattacharya, I would like you to maybe reflect on that tax, that political economy question. Again, in my simplistic mind, we sort of came up with sustainability, didn't we, from the mid-'80s? And, we a lot of hard work, and we plugged and played it, right? But no one, in some ways, had put the deep political economy thinking in place. What do I mean by that? There was never a general theory of sustainability. If you reflect back to Keynes in the 1930s, was that a piece missing? What is the political economy we need, and what's the tax part? If you could speak briefly to those questions, that would be very helpful. And then maybe to UNEP and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. So, Mr. Bhattacharya, and please...
a word of apology. Yeah. I'll have to leave immediately after I speak, since I'm keeping some people waiting for lunch. But I wanted to just say that in this area, one very, very big problem with sustainability is who will ultimately pay for the revenues. So they can only come from, a limited set of sources. They can come from users, they can come from governments, they can come from earmark taxes, or they can come from from value capture. And the models for sustainability are not very good, even though the opportunities are extremely good. And I'm just going to end with giving you an example from my city, which is Washington, D.C. We have a metro system that's largely dysfunctional because they have not been able to tackle those issues and have not been able to make the long-term investments that are needed. There is another utility called DC Water, which is replacing its 100-year-old infrastructure, but managed to sort out those problems, as you said, of taxes and political economy. And they were able to finance their 100-year investment with a 100-year green bond at 4% interest rate. Okay, that's sustainability. So you don't have to look just at developing countries to find these examples. So institutions and political economy are at the heart of the issue. So I absolutely agree with you. And what we need to do is find good examples that countries and local jurisdictions can use in bringing about transformative change.
So maybe you and Lord Stern, your next task would be to write the general theory of sustainability. And if you could launch it in July 2018, that would be really useful, okay? No, listen,
there is actually an exercise underway.
Okay, I can imagine. So listen, thank you for your inputs, and have a good lunch. We're going to run with this for 10 more minutes, Kerry, okay? So I'm going to go to UNEP and the Chicago Council for comments, but then I'd like to, whether Penn wants to come back in, or Rajiv, or whoever in the room. Let's try and finish on a strong conversation, then a quick lunch, and then back to oceans. Why not? Please.
I'm so sorry. I'm just going to take 5 seconds because I have to run for my flight. so I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much indeed.
I'm going to do what you did. I'm going to go on the web TV now and to watch this. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Let's put our hands together for 2 panelists. So Martina, the podium is yours for a few minutes.
Really interesting discussion already over the morning. I wanted to emphasize a few points that I heard, and one was that vibrant sort of plead for indeed cities not only have to but can help with this energy transition that we need to see. I think the point was very well taken that we should not only look at it from an access perspective, but really look at the whole spectrum of SDG 7, basically. So it will ultimately help the ones furthest left behind. If we do things right from the start, there's a lot of investment that will have to go into the infrastructure that is needed as we move forward, and if we don't plan that well, and if we don't spend the additional money that may be needed to make the system sustainable, and that means low carbon, resource efficient, and resilient, we may actually miss the boat, and it will be more expensive further down the line, and that's something we should actually keep in mind. Also, in this, and energy is really interesting as an area because it cuts across so many of the other sectors, because it's a means to an end, right? It's not an end in itself. And just to say that, where it intersects with SDG 11, which talks about housing, which talks about the basic infrastructure, which includes energy, but also includes things like transport. So energy is an issue for those sectors as well. So we heard already Rachel talk about the buildings and what we can do in terms of energy efficiency, but also in terms of making sure that buildings are built in a way that they produce energy as well, and in a decentralized way using renewables. There's a real opportunity here. There will be more heating and cooling need. There's lighting need, and we unfortunately have lost our colleague from Philips who would have spoken in addition on lighting, so some of the appliances stuff. If we do this properly, we will reduce the need for energy supply. So there's a cost issue, but the savings will allow us to make more savings, but we have to put up the money in the first place. So how do we think along those lines? It changes around a little bit the business model and how we think about putting money into projects. But I think we really need to do that. How do we think about transport and linking that to the energy system? So the energy transition linked with a transport transition. Electromobility is really, and again, Rachel said it, I mean, it's around the corner, it's right there. And it will have an impact on how we plan, how we connect to buildings again. So there's something in terms of a horizontal, across-sector integration that needs to fall into place, where we see new business opportunities as well. It will require private sector to think about their traditional value chain in a different way. How can we help facilitate that? That's one big area. So this connection between SDG 11, SDG 12, and how that branches out to the others. So that is one. Now, we have just put the bar so high for cities. And we have to recognize that they don't necessarily have control over everything. They have limited control, but they have at times more control than they think they have. How can we help them to identify those bits where they can actually exert their control and push the boundaries a little more? And I mentioned buildings. Building codes are national matter, but how we implement building code in most places, but how we implement them is actually really at the city level. And here the city can really help in looking at where again, the decentralized energy, how that connects back in. We can look at the procurement power, and that's something we haven't really said. There's something cleaning up well, at home, basically. So where there's control over the buildings, where there's control over the supply of energy. We mentioned big energy consumers, but, well, the city itself is actually a big consumer. So that is a whole spectrum. And the last bit is on finance. That's the last point. And we have seen a number of experiments. We have seen a number of innovative finance mechanisms that are there. How can we help them bring them to scale? How can we help create a pipeline? And their project preparation has come out as something really, really important that we need to help cities to get to grips with. And there is something that's called the CCFLA, the City Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, that actually has taken on that task very much so in helping with this project preparation in terms of technical but also financial capacity. And I would leave it at that. Thanks.
Martina, is it happening? Hi, Martina, thank you very much for that. With the clock ticking, I'm going to go straight to the Chicago Council. I keep getting it wrong. Chicago Council of Global Affairs. There you go. I can do it.
Excellent. Thank you. And this has been a really marvelous conversation, despite the fire drill in the middle. And what it really speaks to is when we think about the opportunity to deliver for residents in these growing cities around the world, you're linking what used to be energy generation that was far away through transmission into distribution, which used to just be where people lived. And the systems are converging in really interesting ways. And so when we're talking about providing access in cities, we're actually talking about the same core technology that we're talking about when we discuss decarbonizing energy systems. It's about renewables and it's about on-site. The anchor to this will really be partnerships. And that's part of what's so important about a conversation like today is it is both cross-sector, thinking about the public sector, working with the private sector, but it's also across the layers. In particular, I think about the public sector inside countries. Cities have some authority. They can flex more muscle in terms of reducing demand, potentially bringing more renewables on site, but they really often need those partnerships with their state and with their nation. And so it's going to take those horizontal cross-sector partnerships and then those vertical cross-government partnerships to truly see this transformation that can, in fact, provide for residents who don't have power today and do it in a way that prevents the challenges that we might see in a more extreme climate situation from tomorrow.
You know what that immediately brought to mind? The word joined up seems to have beginning to disappear from the lexicon. It's being replaced by alignment, whether it's alignment of policy from national through subnational, alignment of financing with what people actually need. But there is a lot of work to do, right?
And there's a lot of opportunity to do it.
I love, yeah, okay. I'm going to finish in this way. And this conversation, I agree with you. I think it could have gone on. Kavita made the point that there hasn't been innovation in financial markets, capital markets, since Green Bonds 2007, which I think SEB, the Swedish bank, pushed with the World Bank, and then 2011, and I forgot what that development was. I would agree with that, but I would, in some ways, float a slightly different take. There's a huge amount of innovation out there. The system is not allowing it to be turned into product and to be scaled and to be mainstreamed, and that's the financial system. Let me give you one example. I referred to $2 trillion of developing world pension funds, slowly deepening pools of capital. And there's a fix that worked really well on municipal finance in North America until the crash of 2008, which was monoline insurance. Very, very focused to get municipal finance into play for its own infrastructure. I'm offering this as one specific example. There's a great example of how a monoline insurance product could strip foreign exchange risk out of locally financed infrastructure projects, right? To get that vehicle into play, you need a good S&P rating. S&P asked the people with that particular product to raise $500 million and then bring it to them for a rating. So they did. And the model is really interesting, and it could free up local money and take them off the addiction of dollar or euro denominated loans in terms of project finance. What was the answer from S&P? Can't give it the right rating because you want to do the stuff in the developing world. My point there is, I think there are specific points within the financial system and the capital market system that it's not bad will or people not wanting to do things, but they can be unpicked to let different pools of capital flow. And I think perhaps that's part of the conversation, that we need to focus down on the granular detail, that what frees up existing pots of capital. Rajiv, to finish and
just one sentence.
Yeah,
I think this capital piece is important, but the other thing I think that we perhaps just want to keep in our minds is this inherently local solutions that we're trying to scale up, and perhaps borrow from lessons in, say, the water industry, for example, in the humanitarian sector, where we know that trucking isn't the answer, right? So water committees were set up in humanitarian response to work with local people and build participation. And so how do you ensure that there's real participation amongst local communities? How do you take examples from Barefoot Solar in Zanzibar, where women entrepreneurs are retrofitting solar? These are the kinds of examples that we also need to keep at the forefront.
I agree. It's the full spectrum. It's not just capital markets. It's all the way across. And Rodrigo, come to you in a second. But Kerry, it strikes me that it might be worthwhile circulating to everybody who participated here. Would be the Bangkok Johannesburg blueprint that was launched at COP21, which it's a 7-page document, but it was drawn up out of very local conversations in Bangkok and then Johannesburg from different communities, and fed into COP21 and launched there. So it might be worthwhile circulating that. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So Rodrigo, to finish, and then,
Regarding taking risk, at the end, I think it's about stakeholders taking risk. I mean, my company is willing to take all the risk available because we know that this is going to be a business for the short and for the medium term. So I think we are not building solar orchards that will generate 200 megas, 50, 100 megas. And we are very committed to that because we know that we have to take risks. And if you guys as well, taking your phrase of no one left behind, don't leave the private sector behind on this. I have to say that. Private sector has a lot to do, and things are changing, cultural changing. Organizations at the local level, private companies at the local level are doing things differently. I'm not talking not only from my perspective and my business, but there's some cultural change.
I get it. Let's put a hand together for the panelists who came back after the non-fire. We're trending on energy. Okay. Okay. That's so we've inveigled our way into the bigger forum. Listen. Yeah, retweet it. This is good. That's what I learned yesterday. Trending is a good thing. I would hope, I can feel there's an energy in this conversation still. If people are up for it, come back in 20 minutes because we'll start the ocean session, which will be fascinating as well. But again, thanks to the panelists. We were interrupted, but we managed to get it back on track. So thank you to all of you who've participated. Thanks to the translators. Thanks to Bob.